When we last left our lessons on the Middle Ages, we left them with beautiful, beautiful castles being built for defensive purposes. Well, as the Middle Ages went along, castles were no longer needed. The Magyars, the Muslims, the Vikings were long gone. Kingdoms stopped fighting with each other. And one of the results of that was the growth of towns. Towns that were being built outside of castles and outside of manor houses. This lesson is all about the growth of medieval towns and how it will change Europe forever. So we're talking a little bit later on in the Middle Ages, around the 900s AD, we start to see a rise of medieval towns. Now these towns had names like London, Paris, Hamburg, Vienna. Those are the medieval towns. That's how they got their start. Now, people that would move to a town had certain rights, okay? So you got to understand that when people were living during these times, and because pretty much of the old remnants of the Roman Empire, there was a lot of openness. So people began to venture away from the manor once the fighting had subsided in medieval times. Manufacturing and trade was revived, all right? So there was the growth of these towns because of trade, all right? And then you can see the routes on this map are medieval trade routes that were opened up and that were built by old Roman roads. So people were moving around the old part of the western part of the Roman Empire, and these towns are going to benefit from that. Now, people also wanted to move into a town to control their own government. You got to understand, if you lived in medieval times, you are always responsible to someone above you, okay? Unless you were the king or a high-ranking lord, all right? Most people were vassals. So these people wanted to have some say in their government because really in their whole lives, they never had any say in government and any say in what was going on in town. Now, this is what would happen. People would begin to leave the old manor, the old medieval manor, and they would move into a town. And when you would move into one of these new towns that were forming, you had specific rights. So we're going to talk next about the specific rights of townspeople. The first one was freedom. So if you moved into this town, you were free, all right? If you were a peasant, if you were a serf, you were free. Okay, that included you as well. And that was very, very appealing to a person that was at the bottom of feudal society, a peasant or a serf. Now, when you got to town, you had exempt status, which meant you no longer had any obligations to your lord or to your manor. You were exempt from that. So you moved into town. You were free. You had no more obligations to your manor. You could start a business if you wanted to, okay? And that was very appealing to people that never had any say in what their lives were about, basically, okay? Now, the old medieval justice and and stuff, things like that were a thing of the past, all right? So if you moved into a town and you got in trouble, these are your early court systems, all right? There was a town justice. There were names like magistrates that were from the old Roman upper class, the patrician system there, and you had a court system, all right, which was growing in these towns. Now, the other thing that you had, and the fourth specific right of a person that moved into one of these new medieval towns, is that you had commercial privileges. And I mentioned that a second ago. Commercial means jobs and businesses. All right, so you could open up your own store if you were a baker, if you were a fishing pole maker, if you were a shoemaker. And that was very appealing to a person that had a trade. A blacksmith, for example, could move into a town and they could set up their own business. And they had privilege to work and set up their business in that town. And that's what we mean by commercial privileges. So these are the specific rights of a person that moved into one of these new European medieval towns. Now, organizations are going to form in these towns, and the organizations were called guilds. Now, a guild was simply an organization of workers, a group of workers, an association of workers. And there were two types of guilds in medieval times. First off was the merchant guilds. Now, if you belonged to a merchant guild, that meant that you were a merchant in town. So this was an association of all types and varieties of workers. So you had an opportunity to pay money to this guild, and monopolies formed, which meant if you belonged to the merchant guild in town, foreigners could not come in and set up a business. You owned that business and so on, okay? So blacksmiths and shoemakers and bakers could all belong. If you were one of those types of merchants in town, you could belong to a merchant guild. Now, speaking of foreigners, on festival days, usually on Fridays and Saturdays, towns would open up their walls. They would open up their gates and they would allow foreigners to come into town and sell their products. But they had to pay a fee before they did that. In fact, that fee was called a toll. A toll. Now think about that word and think about where you have heard that word before. Well, let me explain to you. When a foreigner would come to the gate, most of these towns had walls around them from old medieval times for protection and defensive purposes. So there would be usually only one way in and one way out. Sometimes there might be one way into these towns, and then you'd have to walk through the middle of town to get to the other side, okay? Well, at the beginning of these towns, they all had gates, and the gates were made of pikes, which were 10-foot poles that had sharpened edges at the top of them, okay? So when a foreigner would come to town to sell their product, they would go to the little gate booth. There'd be a little guy there. They would pay the toll, and the little man would turn the pikes open, or he would open the gate. Turn pike. Turn the pikes open, pay a toll. Yes, that's where we get the word turnpike from. On the highway, you pay a toll on the turnpike, and you can go ahead and drive on that roadway. Well, some foreigners paid a fee just to get to the other side of town and get through the town instead of having to walk around. They would turn the pikes open once you paid the toll. Turnpike. Good story. Now, these guilds would set the standards for quality. So if you were a shoemaker and you were making bad shoes, absolutely not. They would come to you and say, listen, bud, you need to pick it up a little bit. We have a certain standard for quality in this town, and you are not living up to these standards. Now, these guilds also acted as charitable organizations. So if you were a baker, a shoemaker, and a blacksmith, and you gave certain money to your merchant guild, if you were to die, the guild would actually help your family out. They acted as charitable organizations for widows and orphans, okay? So your family would be taken care of just in case that you passed away. If you belong to one of these merchant guilds, well, then they would take care of your family. Now, the second type of guild is a craft guild. Now, the craft guild was different from the merchant guild because if you belong to the craft guild, you specialized in one craft. There was a blacksmith guild in town, so all the blacksmiths in town would belong to this blacksmith craft guild. If you were a baker, only bakers belonged to the craft guild. So you could belong to the merchant guild, and you could also belong to one of these craft guilds. Now, just like the knights had a coat of arms, some of these craft guilds had coat of arms, and they had symbols and stuff. This is actually a blacksmithing coat of arms from the olden days, and they specialize in just one craft. Now, within the craft guild, it said that you could regulate your own wages, you could set your own hours, okay? So if you were a member of this guild, most of the people in town worked the same hours and set their wages accordingly. Now, early on in medieval times, as we talked about the other day, it was very important for a young boy to grow up and become a knight if they were of noble birth. Well, later on in medieval times, when the fighting had subsided, the knight wasn't as glorified, all right? It was a little bit harder to become a knight. Now, that's when other little kids wanted to become one of these workers. So with this new group that had formed in town of workers, parents would no longer send their children to a knight to become a knight. They would send their kids at a very young age to a master, one of these master workers, whether it was a shoemaker in town, a blacksmith, a fish and pole maker, or so on, okay? Now, see if you have heard of any of these words. So if you were living in one of these medieval towns, the first stage of training to become one of these master workers was that you were sent to a master and you were the master's apprentice. And when you were a young kid, you learned a trade from a master, whether it was woodworking, whether it was blacksmithing, whether it was shoemaking, whether it was baking, all right? You would learn how to make the bread. You would learn how to make the shoes, all right, and so on. Now, you would then graduate from being an apprentice and moving into the second stage of your training to become a master or master worker, and that was called a journeyman. So you literally worked for the master, okay? You literally would journey from town to town, and at this point of your training, you would learn the business side of it. Now, this is how you would work for the master. Now, the real question is very simple. How do you become a master worker yourself? Well, what you would have to do is once you graduated from becoming an apprentice, and once you graduated from that and became a journeyman, and once you knew the business side of it inside and out, you would literally journey from town to town selling your product and learning the business side. Your master would instruct you, let's say that you were a shoemaker. You would have to make the most perfect pair of shoes and then present it to your master. Now, the master could look at those shoes and say, you know what? This has been a huge waste of my time. Those shoes are terrible. You need to do a better job because I am not allowing you to become a master and take over my business maybe someday. Or sometimes the master would say, I cannot teach you anymore. This pair of shoes is fantastic and I cannot make a better pair of shoes. So then in most cases, you would go on and you would take over this guy's business. And maybe the master was old and would retire out to the countryside and fish every day. And then you would take on an apprentice and so on. We still see these words, apprentice and journeyman, especially if you know anyone that works for Florida Power and Light. If you ever look at one of the FP&L trucks, they usually have an old guy on it. They usually have a young guy on it and a guy a little bit older than the young guy. Well, there's a master electrician on that truck. There's an apprentice on that truck or two, okay? And they still use that word. Now, here's a good question for you. That perfect pair of shoes that kid made for his master actually has a name. It actually has a name. Think about what you would call that most perfect pair of shoes that you would present to your master, hoping that he says they are fantastic and you could become a master yourself. That word is a masterpiece. A masterpiece. And that's where we get the word from. The masterpiece is what you gave to the master in order to become a master yourself. Well, there are a lot of great results of the growth of these medieval towns. And there's one thing that's going to affect Europe forever, and it's the middle class. There is going to be a huge rise in the middle class of workers in Europe. To this day, there are more people that belong to the middle class of people on earth than any other class. Now, when these workers came to town, these shoemakers, these blacksmiths, these bakers, these fishing pole makers, they're going to create a middle class, and a middle class of people that is going to dominate Europe till this day. Now, also, one thing that these towns had to do is they had to find ways to attract people to their town. Now, one result of that is the idea of building beautiful, beautiful cathedrals. Now, the bottom left image is a cathedral outside of Paris called the Chartres Cathedral. It's a beautiful, beautiful place where to this day people go to worship. We're very familiar with the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. It burned down recently. You know that it caught on fire and it's being built back up there. But these are two examples of great cathedrals that were built. Now, I want you to think about what you do as a family, or what you used to do as a family when you went to church on Sunday, or whenever you went to church within your religion. Well, some possible answers would be, well, we'd go out to dinner afterwards, or we'd go out for brunch, or go out for lunch, or maybe you go shopping, or maybe after church, you all would maybe go get your nails done or something with your mom and grandmom or friends or something like that. The point is, usually after church, you go and spend money. Well, guess what? These medieval towns built these huge cathedrals to attract people to their town. Now, if the Chartres Cathedral was St. John the Baptist Church, which is the church that is just to the east of Cardinal Gibbon High School's property, that's my home church. If it looked like the Chartres Cathedral, I'd probably go to church a lot more. It's a beautiful place to go and worship. But this was a tourism thing. When people would come to town to go to church at the Cathedral of Notre Dame or the Chartres Cathedral, guess what they did afterwards? They went and spent money in the shops. They went to have a meal in the restaurants, in the shops, all right? They spent money, okay? So the idea of building these cathedrals were to attract people to their town because there was competition between people to gain money and so on. Now, the most beautiful buildings in Europe are town halls. Now, town halls are places today that if you live in the city of Oakland Park or the city of Fort Lauderdale, you probably don't even know where the town hall is. Well, back in the old days, when you would go to a town, the first place you would go to, and if you were new to town, you would go to town hall because it served as a visitor center. They are some of the most beautiful buildings in all of Europe. In the bottom left image there in Vienna, Austria, I remember being in Vienna and I remember walking by this building and I'm like, oh my gosh, it was the most beautiful building I've ever seen in my life. And I asked, what was it? And I'm like, and the locals told me that it was the town hall. And I was like, the town hall? The town halls that I live in, or that I see in my cities in the United States, are just basically buildings that look like the classrooms in Cardinal Gibbons High School. That's basically what they look like. Well, in Hamburg, Germany, there's the town hall. In Paris, France, there's the town hall. They were built beautifully because this was usually the first building that a person that would visit town would come to. It served as a visitor information center to see what there was to do in town and where to go in town. Now, one effect of these growth of medieval towns is that there was a decline in serfdom. And there's a very easy answer for that. There was hardly any more serfs in medieval Europe because if you came to town, you were free and you weren't a peasant anymore. You weren't a serf anymore, okay? So there was definitely a decline in serfdom. Now, another major effect of the growth of medieval towns was the end of feudalism. Remember, if you came to town, you were free. You had no more obligations to your lord. You had no more obligations to your manor. So the concept of feudalism, which was formed for protection from the beginning when the Middle Ages started, wasn't needed anymore. There was no more wars. There was no more big fighting and so on. So therefore, if you moved to town, you were free. So there's going to be not a need for feudalism. So just as the Europe that we kind of know is starting to grow and get going and these towns are moving, the Black Death is going to hit. And 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe is going to die at the hands of this bubonic plague, which in turn we call the Black Death, which will be our very next lesson when we